Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our public conversation on Glasgow's transport future, which is part of our Connecting Communities programme. I'm Marshall Poulton, Head of Transport Strategy in Glasgow City Council, and I'm really looking forward to this morning as we have some excellent speakers, which I'm sure will lead to some stimulating debate. As you'll see from the slide, we've got Councillor Anna Richardson, Professor Iain Docherty, Professor Loakes, Councillor Clyde Loakes and Jeroen Zuidgeest speaking today. It's a 2-hour programme, but we're going to split it up into 2 parts. The first part will consist of Councillor Richardson and Professor Iain Docherty giving us about 12 minutes each, and then we'll allow 15 minutes for Q&A from about 10:25, and we'll be starting part 2 at 10:45, and we'll get finished for noon. So just to let you know, we've got a good team of background staff working with the technology, so fingers crossed it goes gremlin free. If I just could do a very brief introduction, the whole purpose of this public conversation is to give the citizens of Glasgow and surrounding areas the opportunity to express their opinions, to provide feedback in order to help shape Glasgow City Council's new suite of transport plans for the city. The public conversation is there to provide everyone with an avenue where they can express their views, including residents, workers in the city, local businesses and other organisations. By way of background, we are developing 3 new transport plans strategies for the city, covering a 10-year period up to the year 2030. The 3 strategies will basically be an updated local transport strategy, and that will be referred to as the Glasgow Transport Strategy, an updated city centre transport strategy, which will be the city centre transformation plan, and last but not least, a Liveable Neighbourhoods Plan with funding support from Sustrans. As part of the development of the Glasgow Transport Strategy, work is focused on gathering evidence presented in our Case for Change report, also in our Strategic Environmental Assessment screening and Equalities Impact Assessment screening. In addition, we've also undertaken internal workshops, and we started the external workshops earlier on in the year. However, the coronavirus impacted on our programme in late March. In developing our strategies, we have been following the STAG process, which is the Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance, and we are now at a stage of having gathered the evidence, identified the issues, and now we want to hear from you about the problems, the challenges and outcomes that we have arrived at. If you haven't already read the public conversation document, I would steer you to page 25, which lists the 4 outcomes. We'll hear from Councillor Richardson shortly. However, it might come as no surprise that transport now makes up the largest proportion of carbon emissions by sector in Glasgow and Scotland. Work to decarbonise transport therefore has to be a key feature of the city's ambition to become carbon neutral by 2030. Correspondingly, road traffic is the principal local source which contributes to poor air quality in the city centre. Accelerating the move towards zero carbon road transport is also a key aim for COP26, which has been stated by the host UK government and will be held in Glasgow in November 2021. Getting people to walk and cycle more is one of the most evidence-based and low-tech public health interventions which any city can implement. More active forms of mobility can deliver multiple benefits for physical and mental health, as well as build greater community cohesion at street level. Indeed, the Council acknowledges that issues around transport formed the largest theme in the public response to the consultation last year on its climate emergency work. So with that, I would like to introduce you to Councillor Anna Richardson. Councillor Richardson was elected in Langside in Glasgow in 2015, and she was re-elected in 2017. She currently holds the position of City Convener for Sustainability and Carbon Reduction. Anna graduated with ME Honours in Geography in 2001 and an MSc in Human Resources in 2005. I know, working closely with Councillor Richardson, how passionate she is about carbon reduction, improving air quality and the climate emergency challenges that we all have. And she is a very keen and passionate cyclist as well. So over to you, Councillor Richardson.
Thank you, Marshall, for that introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. In my role as convener, transport is one of my major policy focuses. It's something that I know is critical to achieving so many of our strategic objectives for the city. Our transport options can shape our lives. They determine our job opportunities, access to education, and how we choose to spend our free time. We know that currently those opportunities are not felt equally across the city. And transport has always played a part in improving public health. We simply cannot live active lives if our road network doesn't facilitate walking and cycling. And the pollution emitted from transport harms our bodies as well as our environment. Of course, in times of COVID, the concept of what makes for safe journeys has been turned on its head, and we found ourselves hastily making interventions on our roads as a direct response to this public health emergency. None of this will be news to anyone listening today, and these principles have underpinned many strategic decisions before now. But perhaps we've not made these connections explicit enough and sought to tell this story to the people of Glasgow, of why we must be bold and ambitious like never before. Certainly since taking on this role in 2017, it's become increasingly clear to me that this overarching and in-depth conversation with the people of Glasgow about our transport system is well overdue. But perhaps we also come to this work at a good time, when the crises of COVID and climate are demanding new and creative thinking from all of us about how we shape our future. We have been heading in the right direction with a significant number of policies and projects underway in recent years. Scotland's first low emission zone, the trial of our first school car free zones, expansion of the Next Bike scheme, increased investment in cycling infrastructure, and the partnership working that enabled Rob Royston railway station to reopen recently, to name but a few. Our energies have been focused on sustainable transport, and there is far more to come as we see significant public realm projects such as the Avenues programme progress, reallocating road space as it goes. We've also made choices that encourage a shift away from private car journeys, such as introducing Sunday parking charges and additional bus gates in the city. These may not be instantly popular moves, but they are necessary. We've also demonstrated that as a City Council, we're willing and able to work quickly when the situation demands it. None of us expected the challenges that 2020 has brought, nor could we imagine that transport would become such a significant player in the public health response to COVID. Many of the things we've so often spoken about, from the need to allocate more space to walking, to the clear evidence that when traffic levels drop, people want to cycle, they were happening in plain sight. Across our communities, residents could see an alternative for their streets as they became calmer, filled with people rather than traffic, and the drop in noise and air pollution felt stark. Of course, the dramatic decline in public transport use and the desire to socially distance by using cars for more journeys means we will emerge from the pandemic with challenges as well as opportunities. But now we can have certainty that arguing for the status quo, just because it's always been that way, no longer holds. Nobody can say that change isn't possible or that we cannot adapt to new routines. I'm very proud that we were able to secure £7.5 million of Scottish Government funding for temporary measures for walking, cycling and wheeling during this COVID crisis. Our Spaces for People project is demonstrating to Glaswegians how quickly we can make changes on the ground and how those changes can offer them different transport options. It's also opening up discussion about what transport modes we prioritise and why. So what better time to seek engagement in a public conversation about a different future than now? So I'm delighted that we're officially launching this conversation document today. Within it, you will see our clear commitment to use transport as a tool to improve the city and the lives of our people. We think we've set out a strong strategic direction that tackles the climate crisis, poverty and inequality, and makes Glasgow a city that is both livable and economically successful. Of course, the more voices we hear, the more inclusive that strategic focus will be. So I would urge everyone to get involved and to share this consultation widely. We want to hear from those who haven't always been represented when transport decisions are being made. There are, of course, some aspects of this work that cannot be negotiable. As a city, we've committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2030, and that cannot happen without significant change to the way we move and, of course, how much we travel. But we need to hear from Glaswegians about how we get there, what the barriers and the possible solutions may be. And front and centre of these strategy documents will be tackling inequalities to ensure that every neighbourhood is given the chance to flourish and that our streets are accessible to all. We know that certain groups in our population don't feel as safe as they should due to the design of our urban environment and the traffic on our roads. This is an opportunity to reset that, to recreate Glasgow street by street in a way that enables children to play outside, young people to have more freedom, and older people not to feel so isolated. We can build a city for women, for disabled people, and for senior citizens that works for everyone. And I'm particularly excited that as well as a citywide focus and the city centre transformation plan, we're also developing a neighbourhoods plan. Too often, transport investment has focused on journeys to and from the centre, those classic commuter journeys. But we know that many people live their everyday lives closer to home, within their own communities. Investment in those cross-neighbourhood trips has the potential to bring the benefit of that investment right to their door. And the lockdown highlighted like never before how essential it is that we encourage the amenities that people need to be local and easy to reach. Everyone is now talking about 20-minute neighbourhoods in the 15-minute city. We will bring forward a neighbourhoods plan that can deliver that vision for communities across Glasgow. So through this public conversation and a significant amount of work from the project team, I'm confident that we will identify the best way forward. But of course, what is right is not necessarily easy. Political leadership is essential in taking us from this development of ideas through the difficulties of transition to a place where we can reap the benefits of more efficient transport, cleaner air and healthier streets. If we can win support for bold, ambitious plans, delivery will be easier. We achieve that when we tell the right stories of the future that we are building, and everything is easier with the public on our side. But I'm under no illusion of how tough those conversations can be. We will always face opposition to change, for that is the nature of reshaping streets. Something has to be taken away to allow us to build back something better. And indeed, we're seeing that happen in real time across the cities of the UK as local authorities get to grips with the enormity of implementing temporary measures and the sheer strength of feeling in some areas against traffic restrictions that are being introduced. So I'm delighted that later this morning we will have the chance to hear directly from Councillor Clyde Loakes, a politician who's been through this process and has lived to tell the tale. And he's someone who constantly inspires me to push on further and faster when we know that the rewards will be great for our citizens. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, we've come a long way already. I now look forward to hearing what comes from this public conversation and of developing a set of strategies that will accelerate our progress towards a healthier, greener, more connected city. With ambition and leadership underpinned by evidence, data and real public engagement, there really is so much to gain. And I hope all of you today will come with us on that journey. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Richardson, and thanks very much for keeping to time. We've got a few questions already, but I think I would like to go ahead with Professor Docherty just now, and we'll keep our Q&A for after Iain has spoken. So if I could introduce Professor Iain Docherty. Professor Docherty is Dean for the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Stirling, which he joined in April 2019. Prior to this, he was Professor of Public Policy and Governance and Director of External Engagement at the University of Glasgow Adam Smith Business School. Iain's appointments have included International Expert Advisor to the Swedish National Transport Laboratory and also work as part of the Commission on the National Infrastructure Commission for Scotland and member of the Scottish Ministers' Governance Board, overseeing the revised National Transport Strategy. And I know working with Iain, he has been very influential locally in Glasgow and been part of the Connectivity Commission, which the report was published in April 2019. So over to you, Iain, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Marshall, and to Councillor Richardson and colleagues for the invitation to speak to you all today. So as Marshall mentioned there, I was one of the members of the Connectivity Commission in Glasgow, and we published a report about 18 months ago now with a set of recommendations about how we achieve the transformation in the way we move around the city and the wider region that Councillor Richardson introduced. So I've been asked today to just give you some very quick summary headlines about the most important messages from the Commission report, and also, given the last 6 months that we've lived through, to give you some idea about how I think COVID-19 is changing how we go about delivering the recommendations that were in that report and what we should do as part of developing a plan for the city over the next 10 years or so. So again, on to the next slide, please. So as I say, I'll kick off with just a few highlights about the most important things that we said in the Connectivity Commission report. Next slide. We were really, really pleased with the reception that the report gained, but I have to say that we felt a little bit dishonest at times about that reception, partly because all we did effectively in that report was to write down everything we already knew in one place. And here are the things we already know. Glasgow has too much traffic and car parking it doesn't need. It especially has too much traffic for a city still with relatively low car ownership and a large rail network and an employment pattern so concentrated in the city centre. Despite the effort put into developing the public realm over now about 25 to 30 years, that transformation has reached too few places, especially beyond the city centre. And the level of accessibility that the transport network as a whole offers for the citizens of Glasgow is very, very differential and patchy. So if, like me, you're lucky enough to live in one of the more prosperous suburbs, I've got a choice of very high quality public transport service, and also, of course, are more likely to have access to a car. If you live in other parts of the city, then that situation will be very difficult or different for you, and indeed your access to some of the key sites and public services that the city provides can be very difficult. So on the next slide, I've picked one of the illustrations that we used in the report just to give an idea of that level of differential access to key parts of the city that the current transport network often offers. And effectively what you can see here is a 400-metre radius, I think, around all the railway stations and subway stations in the city. And the background colour is a gradation of disadvantage and inequality across the city. So you can see that the blue spaces are the more prosperous parts of Glasgow and the surroundings, and the red the more deprived. And there are huge parts of the city, particularly in the northeast, along the river front to the west, and Castlemilk there in the southeast corner, where access to the core public transport network is very, very difficult for people. Next slide, please. And as I said, some of the most important services that the city has to offer for its citizens are really quite hard to access if you don't have a car. Perhaps the best example is the Queen Elizabeth Hospital's campus in the southwest of the city, one of the best and a genuinely world-class facility that's a core part of the city's health service, but that's very hard to access for many of the people who depend upon it. And on the next slide, another image from the Connectivity Commission report, we showed that we've got so much potential in terms of the infrastructure and interventions that we could make. And here, this is a kind of standard tram rolling stock that we had a visualisation made up of on Edinburgh Road. So the city has lots of potential in terms of how we could transform its infrastructure to make everyday accessibility in particularly these places where that's hard at present, so much better and improve the quality of life for many citizens. So the next slide summarises our challenge in the report, and it was quite simple. We know what to do, so let's do it, please. Glasgow likes to compare itself to a set of peer cities across Europe and the rest of the world in terms of its economic contribution and quality of life. And in the Connectivity Commission report, we suggested that we should learn from these very same places and how they've dealt with very similar transport problems. So let's do as Glasgow's peer cities have done. And we need to start that process by reducing the level of car traffic that we have, and in particular, to reduce the level of parking so that we can reallocate that road space to other uses away from the private car. We also obviously need to invest and continue to invest in the quality of our public transport network, and we need to start with the bus. The bus still carries many more people than the railway network, and particularly gives access to those parts of the city where people find it hard to get to and from their homes, to employment and to key services if they don't have access to a car. So it's crucial for social inclusion. And finally, we challenged government that it was Glasgow's turn. We looked at the amount of money that was being spent every year on transport across Scotland, and we looked at the history of major investments over the last 10 to 15 year period. And what we've seen is that there's been very substantial investment in transport systems across Scotland, but they've tended to be longer distance and at the regional level. And we argue that it was Glasgow's turn because it's those connections between neighbourhoods within the city which have benefited least from that scale of investment over the last couple of decades or so. So in the next section, I'd like to just offer some reflections on how COVID is already changing the situation to implement the recommendations we had in the report. And a lot of what I'm about to say here comes from a study that I'm currently engaged with my close colleagues at the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds on the impact of the pandemic on how we all move around. The first thing to say is that the first principles of the transport problem and how we have to react to it remain the same, although they've arguably become even more urgent. So the climate emergency has not gone away, and indeed there's lots of discussion now in the media and increasingly in the public debate about a kind of 2 to 3 year recovery phase from the pandemic, starting sort of in the spring of 2021, perhaps, or the summer, when we hope that some form of good therapeutic or vaccine will be available. We've already heard about 2030 being a key target date for this plan for the city, but of course it's also the first key milestone in the Scottish Government's net zero decarbonisation targets. And a 2 to 3 year recovery phase gets us, between a quarter and a third of the way to that target. So the climate emergency has not gone away, and if we spend 2 or 3 years doing things which don't get us towards those targets, then I think it will be even more difficult or arguably impossible to meet them against the timescales that we've set ourselves. Excuse me. The second thing, which I think we've had revealed in really stark terms as the pandemic has unfolded, is that the transport system across the city does not support inclusive growth particularly well. You saw the map of the fixed public transport network overlaying on disadvantage in the city that we produced in the report. And if you look at what's happened to the use of transport during the pandemic so far, we've learned some really interesting things, I think, about how many of those key workers that we've all relied on to keep us safe over the last 6 months depend on services which are creaking and are really not of the standard that we'd like them to be, and that's particularly true of the bus network. So accessibility to key places other than the city centre is very poor, and as people have had to undertake activities in different places in their local neighbourhoods or access healthcare and other services as the pandemic has proceeded, I think we've seen that come into really stark relief in many aspects of everyday life. And finally, what we think seems to be happening in terms of the overall change of behaviour and the working from home, huge rises in working from home that we've seen are probably the best example of this, is that the pandemic has been a huge accelerant of established trends. So whereas in the Connectivity Commission report, we pointed to some trends like a reduction in 5-day-a-week commuting that we expected to play out further over, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years. These things have now happened in 5 or 10 months in some cases. Next slide, please. You've probably seen this slide before, I'm sure. This was the last time that the transport network was shown at one of the number 10 daily briefings, but it's a very important summary, I think, about some of the trends that we've seen over the last few months. Car traffic didn't decline as much as public transport use, and it's more or less back to normal in most places across Scotland, indeed the wider UK, whereas of course public transport use declined some quite staggering figures. Rail use dropped by 97% at the beginning of lockdown, and even bus patronage declined by 70 to 80% in most places. Although interestingly, our research has suggested that bus use declined less in Glasgow than in many other major cities across the UK, and it remained the way for our key workers that have kept many aspects of the economy going to move around over the last 6 months. So next slide, please. This brings us a set of new policy issues that I'm sure if you, in your response to the consultation, will want to think about. The key one is, how will public transport demand bounce back? And how should we think about our prioritisation for investment in it over the future if we don't get back to the levels of public transport use that we saw before the pandemic for some years to come? We're already beginning to wonder about how the spatial structure of the economy might change, and that change might be profound. Now, of course, Glasgow, like many cities, has focused its regeneration efforts primarily on the city centre for the last 10 or 20 years. But if the city centre becomes relatively less important, how does that affect our priorities for investment over the next 10-year period? Is the appetite for more active travel real, and is it sustainable? One of the other very interesting things that we found is that, unfortunately, the increase in cycling use in many places appears to have fallen back quite substantially since the big growth we saw during lockdown, in particular when the weather was better and we moved into summer. But the rise in walking in many places appears to be more resilient. So is there a message in there about the importance of investing in streetscape and public realm and our local communities? And then, if fewer people are using public transport, how do we pay for things in future? And I would argue, has the time come for that conversation that we've put off for far too long about how we tax driving a private car? Next slide, please. So this perhaps is the most pressing issue of all of those, and this is something I'd counsel everybody who is interested in this plan and would like to respond to the consultation to think about. If it is the case that our demand for public transport, particularly the rail network we've invested so much money in over the last few years, takes a long time to recover, what does that mean for how we should move forward and how we should seek to invest what might be quite scarce resources for public transport improvement over the next 10-year period? So in my last couple of slides, I've just got some personal reflections on what I think we should do given that background. So it's important to say that crises like these, of course, are difficult when we live through them, but they are also undoubtedly opportunities to change tack and to change our policy focus if we think that's the right thing to do. So if our travel patterns have changed, then that also means that we have an opportunity to change how we plan for them in future. And I think this is a really important opportunity for us to ask some really profound questions about how we use particularly our streetscape and our priorities for investment. That means we have to take very different decisions in future. I think we have to be much less focused on some outdated, I think now, economic decision-making frameworks that privilege ideas like the value of time and commuting to city centres above all the other kinds of trips that people make in the city. And although that you can already see in the media debate, there are lots of contributions and calls for climate smart or green recovery type strategies, I'm not sure that we've yet understood what that really means. And particularly there's this conflict, I think, between the desire to have a green recovery and the fact that it's car traffic and car use which is rebounded more strongly than any other motorised mode. And that really is the key problem, I think, that we're going to have to address. And wrapped up in that, of course, is this challenge, I think, that the pandemic has shown us just how unequal access to the transport network and therefore to employment and other public services is across the city. And are we really prepared in this 10-year plan period to come to finally grasp that issue? So my last slide, if we know what to do, let's finally do it. We know the transport hierarchy starts with active travel and has single-use private car travel towards the bottom. So let's actually shift our priorities to make sure that we do that. And that means reducing traffic. It means doing things like parking restraint and further road space reallocation for active travel that are politically difficult, but absolutely essential. And it seems to be that the data is telling us that we really need to think about focusing on pedestrians first. We're all pedestrians, even if we use more than one mode of transport in our journeys. And it's when we're on foot that we access the local services, which are the most resilient part of the economy and where our future growth and employment is likely to come from over the short to medium term. So that means supporting local neighbourhoods, and at the city level, I think it definitely means supporting the bus network in a way that we've not been able to do for the last 2 or 3 decades. Buses will become an ever more important part of the public transport mix over the next few years, particularly for key workers. And then finally, in the longer term, the pandemic will pass. And in our Connectivity Commission report, we did talk about reshaping the fixed public transport network into a metro of some kind as the strategic objective that we should work towards. And I don't think anything has changed in terms of that being the strategic objective we should keep. We're still going to have a much better and more comprehensive public transport network across the city, even if our overall demand for mobility in future is less, because unless we do that, we can't meet our climate targets. So this is our project, and the very last slide, sorry, next you can see some links that we'll continue to post data if you're interested on what's happening to transport demand, and also if you'd like to respond to the Council's consultation, you might find the submission that my colleagues at Leeds and myself wrote for the Scottish Government's Advisory Group on Economic Recovery, outlining some of these trends and key challenges at that web link, useful in trying to frame some of your responses. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much for that, Iain. That was excellent. If I could invite Anna back on. Thanks, Anna. As you can imagine, we've got a barrage of questions here, and apologies if we don't get through them all, but I'll try and put them into some form of order because there's a number of duplicates. Anna, maybe if I start off with yourself. The other day on Good Morning Scotland, there was some mention about pilot studies for 20-minute neighbourhoods. The person who was asking the question thought they'd heard Denniston mentioned and was asking if there's anything planned for 20-minute neighbourhoods in general and specifically for Denniston.
Okay, in terms of the neighbourhoods plan that we're working up, that will include some pilots, because it's not enough to have a strategy. We need to show exactly how we're going to deliver it and where we're going to get started and where we're going to take the lessons that have worked in other cities and apply them here. In terms of Denniston, certainly that's an area that has a lot of opportunity already. It's very similar to the ward that I represent here in the south side in terms of having a lot of high population density. It has high street with services on it. There are lots of opportunities there for people to shop locally, to walk to the schools, but then also relatively easily connected straight into the city centre. So there's a huge opportunity there, and it's certainly an area that I know there have been a lot of representations made over recent years from constituents in that part of the city around how we can reduce perhaps rat running and make those streets that are for them rather than for people who are cutting through, or commuter parking, for example. So I think it's the type of area that would lend itself to this type of intervention, but certainly the neighbourhoods plan is still some way away, and if we have immediate issues right now, then going through stages for people, looking at how we can try some of these things in a temporary way first is quite an exciting way forward, and certainly Denniston is an area that I'm very interested in trying to take some of that work forward in.
Thanks, Councillor Richardson. Maybe if I go to Iain now, one of the questions asked was, where is the mention of high quality bus-based public transport? Castlemilk has an excellent network of services operating at a high frequency and with Euro 6 vehicles.
Well, I think I said towards the end there, Marshall, that further investment in the bus network is probably the most important public transport network priority that we're going to have over the medium term, and I stick by that. I mean, I'm looking at the questions in the chat. There's a really interesting divergence in opinion about whether people think the bus network that we have in Glasgow is good or not. My view on that is that it's patchy, that there are some examples of very successful and very high quality bus services, but there aren't nearly enough of them. And I think if you look at many of our peer cities across Europe, their bus networks are much better than ours. And frankly, that's because they spend more money supporting them. So I think it's absolutely crucial that we focus our resources on or tilt them further towards the bus network than perhaps we've done over the last few years, simply because it's going to be such a crucial part of moving people around and getting them safely to and from work and education and other services over the next few years.
Okay, thanks very much for that Iain. Maybe one for both of you, and to some extent, maybe you've covered that Iain. There's been mention made of specific areas such as Possil and Springburn, that there's low car ownership in those areas, but no real public transport links for shopping and hospitals in particular. So this could be seen as quite a common question, and I don't know if either of you would like to comment on this, as it might be an issue for the future.
I'll just make some initial remarks about that, Marshall, based on what we said again in the Connectivity Commission report. So, I mean, that's absolutely true. And I think one of the problems that we've had, the way that the transport network has been structured and the way that investment priorities have played out over the last few years, is that our network is very much focused on radial routes, and it's less of a network that makes cross-city trips as easy as they might be between many of these locations. And it obviously doesn't help when we take decisions like building our major new hospital in effectively a kind of peripheral site in the city that's quite hard for many people to access. So we are going to have to work a lot harder, I think, to turn our public transport services into much more of an integrated network than they currently are, because at the moment most of them are effectively a bundle of radial routes. And of course that then opens up a whole set of questions about frequencies that we need, whether we need to change the route network, and a whole set of issues on fares and ticketing that I doubt we've got time to cover and do justice to this morning.
Okay. Councillor Richardson, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to add to that, and I totally agree with what Iain's saying about the radial routes, and that is a necessary framework for any city, but it does create problems. And certainly what we're hearing here in these concerns about the bus services is echoed in other pieces of outreach that we've done when we were working up some plans on how we should build a North City Way as an active travel highway, essentially. What came back in our initial discussions with the community was that actually coming into town and back was less important to them as a community than the cross-community links, because of the local high streets that mattered to them perhaps more than coming into city centre, and lots of journeys that different parts of society do that aren't necessarily the 9 to 5 commute, and how we can make those more accessible. I think it's going to be a real challenge without significant investment for public transport to create all those routes. And where those routes are perhaps shorter and more accessible, that's where walking and cycling really comes into its own in those under 2-3 kilometre cross community trips. We can start to create more connections that way by making active travel a real viable mode of transport throughout communities, and then public transport can focus on those longer journeys, on those journeys that are less practical to be done in an active way. And together I think we start to chip away at part of that problem.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Richardson. Maybe one for both of you. Again, one of the audiences is asking, how is transport planning and infrastructure design taking into account the need to also consider other aspects that directly affect communities, such as affordable heat and district heating, and any climate adaptation solutions? Do you think we need to join all the dots together on all the climate action devices that we need to deploy?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that one first. Certainly, we need to be looking more at place-based approaches. We need to be looking at these as holistic solutions, and certainly the last thing we want to do is to be digging up the same area 2 or 3 times to bring in different solutions. I think we need to be looking at, for example, the way the Avenues programme is adding in sustainable drainage. It's looking at greening up streets at the same time as it's taking road space away from cars and private vehicles and giving that over to walking, cycling and public transport where necessary. So I think we have got some examples of how that's happening already, looking at projects like Ruggedised, where we are developing a smart street. So we're trying to connect in local heat generation, storage of that energy, and then enabling that to be used either to heat homes, or whether we're generating renewable electricity that then can be used to help charge electric vehicles within that location. There's lots that can be done to tie heat, energy and transport together in terms of our infrastructure projects. We're already starting to do it. I think we could always do more of it. We can always do it better. And as we get ever closer to 2030, we have to do it on a much bigger scale and far, far faster.
Thanks, Councillor Richardson. Iain, anything to add to that?
Just to agree with that, Marshall. So one of the other things I've been involved in recently was as a commissioner on the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland, and in our reports we also highlighted that transport and domestic heating were the two biggest sectors and most difficult to fix in a sense if we're going to meet our net zero commitments. So Scottish Government is aware of that. So it's another area I think where people that are on the webinar today who've got close interest and commitment in these things need to make sure that they continue to lobby the Scottish Government to make real its commitments and its response to these kind of things. So for example, one of our recommendations in the Infrastructure Commission was that we should try to think about our investment in infrastructure much less in terms of silos. So just as Councillor Richardson said there, that if we're going to go in with a major investment in transport infrastructure that is there to benefit a local community, let's make sure that we capture all the potential benefits in other infrastructure that we can do in the one set of works, rather than repeating ourselves and spreading our resources too thinly. But there's a real urgency to this, so I'd encourage everybody to try and hold the government to account as best you can through your personal involvement or the NGOs or other organisations that you're involved in.
Thanks, Iain. That's tremendous. And maybe since you've got the floor, Iain, again back to the Connectivity Commission, very direct question. Can a ticketing system be implemented whereby it can be automatically used on train, subway, bus, even without any disruptions?
Yes, it can, and of course the main thing to say here is that it's not the technology which is difficult. I think we've spent a long time searching for technological solutions to this in the form of smart cards or other things that we don't really need. Most cities across Europe have of course been able to do this for decades using simple paper tickets. So it's about two things. It's about the regulatory environment, which is difficult and complex, and that involves some quite tricky, devolved and reserved rules as well. But one of the things that I hope does come out of the pandemic is that some of the simple things like ticketing reform that we should have done a long time ago, and this is what I meant when I said there's an opportunity here to do things that we should be catching up with. So again, absolutely full agreement that it's time to simplify our ticketing system and make it much easier for people to use.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Iain, there was one here. It wasn't so much a question as a statement. Docking stations for bikes should be included at every subway station and supermarket, and the suggestion is we should get businesses to sponsor docking hubs. Councillor Richardson.
So the Next Bike scheme's been very successful, and it's almost a victim of its own success that every time we announce more stations, most of the complaints I get are, why are they not near me? And I think that is a positive problem to have. It shows that we're growing the network in a sustainable way. But certainly the contract that we signed for Next Bike and for the number of stations we roll out was done pre-climate emergency and pre-COVID as well, and that changes everything. So I think we now need to look at how we can be creative in terms of getting extra investment in and getting more stations in. And I think those locations mentioned, things like supermarkets, transport hubs, they're trip generators. Those are places that people want to go and want to stop off and leave a bike there. And I think those are the places where we have a real potential. As we grow the scheme, as we move further from the city centre and more into communities, we've got great opportunities there if we can find some creative ways of paying for those, whether that's through private investment, whether that's through extra government funding. But certainly the Next Bike scheme has been hugely successful, and really the only thing holding it back is how quickly we can roll out more. And the way it's been used over lockdown has been phenomenal. We've seen, really impressive numbers, and of course it's free for all users until March. A little plug for that, so get out and use them. So yeah, totally agree. Let's keep rolling more out and get them out there as fast as we can.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Richardson. We've just about run out of time. I think we've got time for one more question, and leave Councillor Richardson with the last word on this one. Councillor Richardson, will the SNP Council do more to challenge First Bus on poor, infrequent services? and how they run into housing schemes?
I want us to keep having some really good, robust conversations with the bus operators. We have tried to build a strong relationship with them through working on the low emission zone. We've had to work together, we've had to cooperate, and I think that has driven improvements in the bus fleet, for example. And we can still have those conversations around where those bus routes go. I think it has to be part of a wide conversation. As I was saying, we do have to, and Iain was saying as well, we need to think about where we prioritise investment in public transport. I would really like to see buses being prioritised and certainly being more strategic around where bus routes operate and ensure that they then connect up to other transport modes as well, where perhaps a bus service isn't going to be as easy or viable to run. There are always going to be challenges, I think, on this one. It's always going to be difficult to work in an environment where we don't have direct control over the buses. We just need to continue to explore all the options we have available to us just now, and new powers that came through the Transport Act. And again, just be a little bit considered about how we use those powers and how we get the most value, we get the best service we can for the public investment that we make.
Iain and Anna, thanks very much for your contributions and your time this morning. And if we were normal times, we would ask everyone to give you a bit of applause, but unfortunately can't do that in the virtual environment. I know Iain's got to shoot off to another engagement, but you're more than happy to take part. But thanks very much for your time, for presentations, and also staying for the Q&A. And we're now going to move on to part 2. Okay, thanks. Okay, if we could maybe move on to part 2 now. We're going to have three speakers, and we'll run through with presentations until about 11:30, and then we should have about a good 30 minutes for Q&A after that. So if I could introduce Professor Karen Loakes. Dr. Loakes is a Professor of Human Geography in the School of Environment, Education and Development at the University of Manchester. She's over 20 years experience of social research in transport and mobilities, employing a variety of mixed method approaches to the issues of mobility, accessibility and social justice. Karen is also a world-leading expert on transport and social justice in the global north and south, and is currently an academic advisor for the social assessment of the Lower Thames Crossing project. Karen's also leading the International Network for Transport and Accessibility in Low-Income Communities, which is a global network of academics, policymakers, non-governmental organisations and frontline agencies to promote transport justice in global south cities, and Karen also researches issues of energy poverty and environmental justice in UK context. So delighted to have you here, Karen, and over to yourself.
Thank you very much, Marshall. So good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit generally around issues of transport mobility, accessibility, poverty, and their interconnection with social justice. A lot of the issues that have been raised, both by Iain Docherty and by Anna Richardson, are very relevant to this talk. I think particularly what I'll be emphasising here is more around low-income and disadvantaged communities and how we have to be careful when we're targeting our policies to make sure that their needs are being met. So as I say, the presentation is general, but relevant for Glasgow. So I think people talk a lot about transport poverty, and I think that it's quite wide in its definition. It doesn't just simply mean that there's no transport option available. It can also be, and that's suited to the individual, but it can also be that the transport and existing transport options don't reach destinations where people want to take out their activities. And this sounds like there are many places in Glasgow that this would apply to. There's also an issue around cost. If people are spending too much of their weekly income on transport, that then this can bring them below the poverty line and actually mean that they can't connect because they can't meet their transport costs. And this again has come up in some of the discussion groups that have discussions in the chat room. And there's also an issue around time. So if we're expecting people to spend very large amounts of time coming in and out of the city centre before they can connect to another bus or another train in order to be able to get back out again to another area that actually could have been much quicker for them if they'd been able to travel there directly, then obviously they waste that time that they could be usefully using elsewhere, either spending time with their children and families or working. And that can also be a big issue. And then finally, because actually low-income people and lots of minority communities have less access to cars, they spend more time walking. They spend more time actually exposing themselves to the dangers of the road network, not only in terms of deaths and injuries, but also in terms of high levels of pollution exposure and noise and other issues. And quite often they're also physically located in places where pollution levels are higher because they're located near to busy roads. But finally, there is this issue, and it's coming up a lot in case of this vision, that there's insufficient participation, particularly for many marginalised groups, in the transport decision-making process itself. And it takes a very long time to redress many of the decisions that have been made in the past. So it's important to have direct involvement within the planning process. And as we're hearing, it's not just about transport, but it's about how we roll out the city as a whole. So if you want a 15-minute city, you can't just control the transport networks. You have to control the land use planning, the housing, and the connectivity between those and activities. Next slide, please. And this picture, which is perhaps a little difficult to see, is that whilst we're talking about transport disadvantage, we have to understand that there's also all the other challenges that people experience in terms of their social disadvantage. So if you have no job, if you have no income, if you have no skills, if you have ill health and poor housing, there is an intersectionality between that and your transport disadvantage. So you end up doubly disadvantaged. You think jobs and other issues become inaccessible to you, but this also reduces your life chances. It reduces your social networks. It reduces your social capital, and eventually you become socially excluded, which means locked out of participation in society as a whole. And this can be changed. This can be changed through the economic and political structure. It can be changed by thinking differently about our social norms and practices and not assuming that, for example, the car is a privilege right for everybody and that many people won't or want to drive and maybe cannot. And it's very much, as Anna was saying, about strong governance. Governance needs to intervene. And whilst I understand that we don't control our bus networks, we have to. We have to get in there and plan the networks, because otherwise we can't. We'll just be pouring more money after bad money. Next slide, please. So it's very clear that some people are more affected than others with transport poverty, but it's not that hard because to identify people in transport poverty, because they really align with people that are in income poverty for a start. So we already know that a quarter of households in the UK don't have regular access to a car, but that's 60% in the lowest two income quintiles. I'm not sure if it's the same for Scotland, but I suspect it might even be higher. We know that half the UK population cannot drive or don't drive, and that's 67% of all job seekers cannot drive or don't drive. So unless you have a decent public transport network, they are not going to be able to reach a job. Women, children, older people, young people, minority populations are also overrepresented in the groups of transport poverty, as well as people living in rural and peripheral areas, and especially in deprived areas that are the worst affected by transport poverty. Okay, next slide, please. And just to make it stark, we are talking about 14 million people living in the UK below the poverty line. That is not an insignificant amount of people, but we often don't actually recognise these people because they don't have such a loud voice. They don't feel as included or listened to as the average population. A lot of people that are living in destitution, who we're hearing more and more about relying on food banks and problems with housing and heating warmth, are the very people that don't have a voice. The same with children, and the same with pensioners and pensioner poverty, although that has declined. I don't know, is it worse in the Scottish context and in Glasgow as a city? Is it worse during and post-COVID? I suspect so, but I'm not done research on this, so I don't know myself personally. But these figures need to be looked into so that we don't see this as a minority issue, but as a majority issue. It is important to address the issue of transport poverty and not just the needs of the people that already have high access to good transport links. We need to target these people and areas. Next slide, please. So we know that the lowest income populations, and this is compared to the average, travel about half the distance and half as frequently as the highest populations. And these patterns particularly were re-emphasized in COVID. So we're seeing people not traveling for a variety of reasons to do with the definitions of transport poverty I've put up before, not traveling, not necessarily because they don't want to, but because they can't. And if what we do is not address our land use and the long distances and the poor planning options that don't allow people to connect to activities, either through retrofitting public transport, then basically you will have social exclusion. So it's very important to recognise that number of trips that people take, the time they spend travelling and the distances they spend travelling. Look, you can see that the distances are particularly low for the lowest income and the second income quintiles. And that is particularly because the second income quintiles may well be working, may well be economically active, but are actually not able to search very far for jobs and to connect with other facilities such as education and healthcare. Next slide, please. And can you activate this? It's an active slide, so thank you. So what the other thing is that even people who have cars often struggle in order to afford the trips that they need to make. So in this slide, we can see that to the left of the slide where it says 9%, we have 9% of the population who spend a large amount of money on their car-related travel costs, but actually are on very low income. And it's 11% more if you look at the ones that spend very little but are on low income. And this basically means that they've flipped themselves into debt and economic destitution simply because they have to afford a car because they have no other travel option. It's called car-related economic stress. So it's a small percentage of the population that actually are driving even though they can't afford to. Thank you. Next slide, please. And the wider social consequences of transport poverty. And these are some stark things. We see, because the car has priority in areas, we see large amounts of lack of traffic safety, poor delineation of public space for walkers. We have all the issues of pollution. We see social isolation amongst our elderly populations. We have all sorts of issues with traffic congestion and also flooding. So it's not just about addressing people's inability to be able to get places, but recognizing that these lead to wider consequences, that the reliance on the car is leading us to wider social consequences that are negative as well for our cities. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'm sorry, this has been a very brief presentation by necessity, but if you want more information, you can go to my web pages or you can contact me directly on Twitter. That's great. Thank you. Or by email. Okay, over to you, Marshall.
Yep. Yep, thanks very, excuse me. Thanks very much for that, Karen, and hopefully you can stay online for the Q&A at 11:30. That would be great. Moving on now to Councillor Clyde Loakes. For those of you who don't know Councillor Loakes, Councillor Loakes is the Waltham Forest Deputy Leader and Cabinet Member for Environment, and he's been a councillor for the Leytonstone ward in Waltham Forest for about 22 years now. Councillor Loakes has a deep understanding of the workings of local and national government, and he also understands how policies are developed and shaped to deliver for local residents and communities. He's widely respected in local government circles across the full political spectrum, and Councillor Loakes stood down as leader of Waltham Forest in around about 2009, after about 6 years at the helm. So Councillor Loakes, he's provided the political leadership. Excuse me. He's provided political leadership from the outset of the initial bidding process through to the implementation and delivery of the multi-award winning and groundbreaking £27 million Mini Holland Enjoy project scheme in Waltham Forest, and that basically seeks to improve the levels of walking and cycling, active travel, and reduce cab-based journeys in the outer borough of London. And indeed, it actually got airtime on BBC Scotland on Sunday. I was listening to that intently as I knew you were coming on to this panel today. So, Councillor Loakes, over to you.
Thank you, Marshall. I don't think I've ever had anyone read out my biog before. It makes me cringe, actually. So I'll have to do some amendments to that going forward. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me along this morning to talk to you about our experiences in Waltham Forest, which is, as Marshall's alluded to, and probably many of you know, one of the 30-odd London boroughs. It's got a population of about 280,000, and it's got Chingford in the north, Walthamstow in the middle, Leighton and Leytonstone in the south of the borough. And the south of the borough is kind of more in keeping with inner London, and the very north, Chingford, probably more in keeping with kind of suburban London, or even some of the smaller countryside areas, which we're right on the edge of. So in a nutshell, the Waltham Forest Mini Holland programme has been a programme that's been ongoing for about 7 years now. It was a programme initiated by a former mayor of London to try and get more people walking and cycling in outer London. We are classified as an outer London borough. And in that time, we've delivered over 30 kilometres of segregated cycle track, 60 plus modal filters. They're the things that prevent rats running through traffic coming through our residential areas to bypass the traffic management systems on our main roads, but still allow children on micro scooters, people on cargo bikes, cycles, and pedestrians to move through those areas. So that's really, really positive. Loads of what we call blended crossings, which reinforce pedestrians right of way at local junctions. Taking out informal pedestrian refuges on kind of main roads and putting in formal crossing points at the points where we know people want to cross roads rather than what was previously convenient for car drivers to allow them to scamper across the roads. About 500 bike hangers we've installed in residential areas, and that's the most of any local authority in the UK by a long shot, as well as major cycle parking hubs at train and rail stations. We have 4 tube stations in Waltham Forest and about 7 or 8 rail stations as well. Next slide, please. And next, click. So this all started off in 2014. Waltham Forest was one of 3 boroughs that was awarded £27 million to spend on making it better for pedestrians and cyclists. Build it and they will come kind of approach to matters. And our kind of USB, if you will, was what we call villages at the time, a network of villages that would prioritise local residents and take out through traffic, encouraging them then to kind of walk and cycle more, particularly for those short car journeys, like dropping the children off at school, like popping to the local shops. Of course, villages have evolved over the past 7 years. You know, they moved into livable neighbourhoods, they became low traffic neighbourhoods, and now we're talking about 20-minute neighbourhoods. And it's all very, very exciting because none of these things should ever stand still. They should constantly be evolving as we adapt. And, you know, clearly climate emergency was a big issue, obesity crisis, air quality were big issues that were pushing this agenda for us in London. COVID-19 and its impact not just on our health and well-being, but how we've worked and adapted and responded to lockdown, how technology has evolved to support us working from home and doing things differently on a day-to-day basis. All of those things are helping now shape our response to low traffic neighbourhoods, livable neighbourhoods, the 20-minute neighbourhood. Click, please. So we started off with some trials in Waltham village at the heart of the borough, and every single one of our schemes, and we've delivered about 30 odd different schemes now as part of our Mini Holland Enjoy programme, has been endorsed through engagement and public consultation. Only 2 were rejected, and those 2 we didn't take forward. However, 5 years on, residents in those areas, seeing the difference that's being made in those other areas, the positive outcomes being made in those other areas, insisted that they were reconsulted, and they were reconsulted. In both of those schemes, the consultation responses came back positive this time. So we've gone back and we've built those low traffic neighbourhoods, livable neighbourhoods, 20-minute neighbourhoods in those particular communities in Walthamstow. However, there is always going to be a loud minority who does not like change, does not like the approaches, is not convinced by the whole wealth of arguments that now sit behind making changes to how we move about our local areas. And here, this was at the first one, you know, and in London, we like a prop to demonstrate our anger. We like emotive language to demonstrate our anger, largely in these cases because the wealth of evidence is not on the protesters' side. So, you know, why not stick a coffin in to the protest? And that's me standing next to the coffin. Why not quote Berlin Wall, Iron Curtain as ways of trying to kind of get an argument across that has actually no evidence underpinning it? Next click, please. So all the way through our past 6-7 years of engagement, we've done a huge amount, we've invested a huge amount of time in working with our residents, starting off with what we call a perception survey, finding out what people think about their local area, what changes they would like to see in their local area. We then kind of build some kind of ideas about kind of public realm interventions that we can make that respond to those particular challenges and concerns. We then take residents through residents workshops where we kind of put some early ideas out there and they work in groups to tell us whether we've got the modal filter in the right place, we've got the pocket park in the right place. We then tweak those schemes some more. We then go out to public formal consultation and we get the responses in, and quite possibly we tweak those schemes again. In fact, every single one of our schemes that we have delivered has been tweaked a number of occasions through this whole process. But the one thing that we haven't done is totally downgrade and dilute them, going back to how we used to approach these kind of highways interventions in the past, where basically you went back and said, well, the car drivers are really unhappy about this, so all we're going to do is put a small chicane in to try and slow things down. We've been very clear from the outset, this is about radical change. This isn't about what used to happen. And I've repeatedly said, I did not come into local politics to simply manage the status quo. I came in to make a difference, a positive difference, and the Mini Holland Enjoy programme has enabled myself and my borough to make some real difference to the air quality of our residents, to the health and well-being, wider health and well-being of our residents, to help with that climate emergency response, and clearly, as we've been in lockdown for nearly 6 months, enable our local town centres and shopping parades to thrive because we'd already prioritised pedestrians in those spaces. People were leaving their homes and they were going to those local shops. They weren't walking in to our kind of big town centres anymore. They were supporting their local area and they were engaging with their local area in a lot better and more sophisticated way than they have done previously. Next slide, please. Click. Key part of the consultation process, we've used online tools such as Commonplace to kind of help shape responses, get people's live views on what's happening on the ground, what they'd like to see happen on the ground, what they don't like, so we can constantly evaluate and decide what the final schemes should look like. Or in the case of the South Leytonstone low traffic neighbourhood, this is one of the ones that we put into the London Streetscape emergency funding in response to COVID-19. This is one we just simply put in, and we're using experimental traffic orders to kind of do that, and we're kind of monitoring and consulting over 6 months whilst the scheme is in place, as opposed to consulting in advance of the scheme going into place. And clearly a tool like Commonplace enables us to kind of pick up any trends, identify any problems with the scheme, and hopefully respond to them almost within a day or two of that problem being kind of flagged up. Next, please. Data is really, really key to understanding what was happening in advance of you coming up with the design, development and implementation of your scheme, as well as monitoring the impact of the scheme. And it never ceases to surprise me wherever I go that shopkeepers constantly overestimate the amount of their customers that visit them that arrive by car. They constantly overestimate massively for the need of car parking. And Lea Bridge Road is our busiest road in the borough for every single mode of transportation, whether it's car, bus, bike, pedestrians, whatever, you know, and the businesses on there that constantly over-referencing how people arrived at those shops on that road. So businesses saying 63% arrived by car, actually the visitors, the shoppers, only 20% were arriving by car. But it's only when you start to get this data that you can start to really push back and challenge some of the ingrained status quo and policies that have got us into the place that we were in Waltham Forest, and that many places still find themselves in, and that is the car and the needs of the car dominate and determine how we shape our residential streets, how we shape our town centres, and how we shape moving around our spaces. Click, please. You know, and as we can see, you know, vast majority of people are walking to these relatively local town centres and businesses, and what they want is less traffic. So why, for all of those years, were we encouraging more traffic by creating short-term car parking capacity, by creating free car parking capacity? You know, they were fundamentally the wrong things. What people want was less traffic. And we know through the evidence that if you improve a place for pedestrians, for people arriving by public transport, by bike, they spend more in that local place over the course of a year than anyone arriving by car. If they arrive by car, they do their big shop. They don't go into the little shops. They don't grab a coffee. So the economic value of making our spaces better for active travellers is well enforced, and the evidence is stacking up for that. And then when you throw in the climate emergency and what we need to do, when you throw in our challenges around air quality, obesity, when you throw in the fact that we're not all going to be flocking back to offices in city centres anymore as part of whatever a new normal is, more of us are going to be working from home for a lot longer. This is the opportunity to totally revive our traditional shopping parades that used to support our local residential communities. This is that time where we can really make that happen and take the strain and the stress off of some of the things that we have done over the recent decades. Click, please. You know, and engaging with our community has been absolutely fantastic. The way our community have taken ownership of some of the parklets and pocket parks that we've introduced, looking after the planting, taking ownership of the planting, the way some community groups have sprung up to help mobilise and get people who haven't traditionally cycled onto bikes, whether it's people with disabilities, whether it's kind of women from BAME communities. You know, we have seen some phenomenal, very powerful groups kind of spring up, seeing this as an opportunity for kind of liberation, as an opportunity to explore their neighbourhood in a way that they were never able to do before, because they feared the car or because they had caring responsibilities for children and for elderly relatives. They're now seizing this opportunity because the borough is safer for them to get around and explore in a way that they never did before. bringing residential groups together. Community cohesion has really thrived as a consequence of taking out thousands of motor car vehicle movements a day from local residential areas. People walking to school with their neighbours to drop their children off, standing chatting in some of the formal places that we've created in the road, what was formerly highway, that they would never have been able to do, because now it's a pocket park and they can hear each other talk and they've got the space to have that level of engagement. Click, please. Click. Thank you. And yeah, and there's been the protests. There's been masses of protests. Don't go, this is hard stuff, but it's hard stuff for the right reasons. It's hard stuff for the right outcomes. Now, if I believed in 2018, we have all-out elections. We had all-out elections in Waltham Forest. We do every 4 years. So this was 4 years into the programme of delivery, at the height of what we were delivering. You know, in Waltham Forest, every single household had a view on what we were doing. But if I believe the social media, if I believe the petitions, if I believe the demonstrations on our town hall steps, the largest in the borough's 50-year history, not over cuts to councils' budgets through austerity. No. Proposed kind of introducing modal filters that took out rat running through traffic from residential streets. You end up with 500 people on your town hall steps shouting and screaming your name with various Anglo-Saxon words thrown in between my first and my surname. You know, that's the reality of what we cause. But if I believed everything that I'd read, seen, you know, I was a goner. I was toast. My party was toast. But what happened? Actually, those Labour councillors in Waltham Forest that championed what we were doing saw their majorities go through the roof. Every other party stood against, and independents stood against what we were doing. They were jumping on bandwagons because they listened to the loud voices. They did not listen to the silent majority who knew and understand why we were doing these things and that this was the future. So, you know, politically, it makes real sense to do this. And ultimately, as politicians who have to do this, we're going to look at the politics of it. But my message is, you know, don't go into politics and manage the status quo, because that's how you end up in the mess that we've ended up in with regard to this agenda in this country, where we appease constantly the needs of car drivers. You know, don't go into politics unless you want to make a positive difference. This agenda has made a positive difference in Waltham Forest, continues to make a positive difference in Waltham Forest, and is now shaping, you know, because of what we've done, shaping what's going on, not just in London, not just in the UK, but across the world. Thank you very much.
Hi, Councillor Loakes. Thanks very much for that. That was really interesting, and I appreciate you keeping to time. If we can now move on to the last speaker for this session, who is Jeroen Zuidgeest. Jeroen, I hope I got that pronunciation correct. Jeroen is the founder of the Studio for New Realities, which is and is also a strategic urban advisor and architect working on the realisation of a very pleasant, attractive, responsible and intelligent city. Jeroen's also especially interested and experienced in projects in the urban context, ranging from design to research to execution, and that's really from regional planning to master planning and to an architectural scale. And he's got extensive experience in hands-on design of research projects for various programmes, clients in various contexts. So over to you, Jeroen.
Brilliant, thank you very much for the intro. Always interesting, somebody else here reading your bio. And very valuable to be able to contribute today. And anyway, thanks for the ability to share insights following the work we've been doing as a team on the DRFs the last couple of years, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So I'll take you through the work and share a reflection on what I would call a need for smart and sensitive mobility solutions, and very important with the subline to be able to build a pleasant and thriving and responsible city. And it's quite clear, and I think already stated by some of the previous speakers, if we want to be able to realize that, again, a city that is pleasant, that is thriving, and that is responsible, even more important in these times today, strategic mobility solutions are key to this. So I'll take you through this in 2 steps. Firstly, a general overview of what we've been working on as a team on, and of course in close collaboration with the GCC on the regeneration strategy package. And secondly, an overview of proposed mobility solutions as one of the key drivers for pulling off urban regeneration, if you want. So first part, with big compliments to Glasgow City Council and the initiative they took, say 3 years ago on the launch of the regeneration following a series of districts, neatly numbered 1 till 9, not necessarily with as hard geographic borders as they're indicated here. Saltchee being taken care of as the first one in a second phase, Blindswood Central, Broomilo and St Enoch, and currently as a team working on Merchant City, Learning City, and Cowcaddens and Townhead. As said before, a first phase where we were involved in as a team, the southwestern part of the city, so design led by MVDV, where I held a former position as partner in close collaboration with Austin Smith-Lord colleagues as local consultant and local designer, and Ryden and Arab Space Syntax and other consultants supporting this. So the task was twofold. On one hand, it was a strategic operation, but secondly, and most importantly, influencing the quality of life of Glaswegians. So we work towards what we call a layered strategy, which of course should lead to spatial interventions, but most importantly, and I think in that sense, I would also like to echo some of the contributions by the previous speakers, how this can contribute to improving the socio-economic performance of the city. And again, in my opinion, in our opinion, mobility is key to provide access to work and to education and to culture, being extremely important, especially in these days of the COVID crisis that we're collectively facing. So what we've been doing, and I think that's key of the previous round of DRFs, and we're trying to sort of accelerate and take it one step further in the current work that we're doing, is not to deliver another report, but most importantly to transfer or translate it into a handbook with actions, not top down, not one big plan, but more a strategic package of interventions. And I also really like, in that sense, Iain Docherty's quote, "We know what we need to do, so let's simply do it." And again, from sort of big words and from sort of general observations to action. So we followed an approach, back to the slides now, which is evidence-based, where we, of course, used good old field work, had an intense trajectory of participations with a series of wider stakeholders and audience, simply go out on the street, the good old days when it was still allowed, worked on positioning and branding of these areas of the city, if you want, defined a series of objectives, and followed a sort of intense process of design-driven research to simply test, to optimize, and to conclude in sort of constructive dialogue we had with the different team members. And most importantly, as said before, define a framework and translate that into an action plan with simply stakeholders and money and time and preconditions connected to that. So we started with a series of observations, and time is too short to share everything with you in detail, but I'm going to click through them lightly. The images speak for themselves. But if you look at the streets, sort of Glasgow having this beautiful Victorian history, but in the current situation, we were sort of shocked by this plaque of tarmac, as we called it, and sort of cars and the buses everywhere, and its effects on the sidewalk, the space for people, and the lack of green and trees as well. Secondly, if you look at the space this takes, the public space taken up by cars being disproportionately high in comparison, especially to other cities as well, 62%, I would say. I have to admit, as a planner with quite a bit of international experience, being fairly shocked by this. And also, if you look at public space, it's big, it's beautiful, it's surrounded by the Victorian architecture, as said before, but not necessarily being remarkable. And I'm highly aware of the sensitivities for example, on the competition that the city run on this plaza. But it deserves attention, it deserves money, and it deserves leadership in that sense. Same counts for the river, sort of beautiful backbone, where you would expect this to be the centerpiece, the beauty and the pride of the city, and where in history this was a sort of economic backbone of the city. In the current situation being underused, the M8 clearly needed as well for the economic performance of the city, but being a highly disruptive element in the current situation, and buildings that do not necessarily connect it, maybe in the good old tradition of planning in the UK, where following a plot-based development and in some parts, if you allow me to say, a little bit lack of integral approach, which is clearly needed to connect better and build a dialogue between architecture and urbanism, if you want. But of course, with a great potential for a more sustainable mobility, and I think that's also clearly what is echoed in the Connectivity Commission report. And we found extensive amount of empty plots to work on, which you could say is the biggest potential to develop in Glasgow. So these series of observations we translated to a series of strategic interventions, where this represents the mutable or available space, if you want, and compared Glasgow to other cities, sort of high-level benchmark, and actually concluded that if you want the level of vibrancy and activity and economic, socio-economic performance that you find in other cities, Glasgow should work towards doubling its amount of inhabitants, roughly. This is not sort of scientifically proven, but there's space to organize that. So if you look at the current population being very low in the existing situation, there's a lot of buildings, but a lot of empty shopping floors, etc. It's fairly easy to work towards a model where you're able to double it, as calculated and tested in this model, simply sort of using the amount of vacant and available lands there. Which would lead, of course, to sort of diving more in detail and investigating the possibility for a more sustainable mobility, and where the shift in modes of transport is something that is very logical, I would say is a no-brainer. And if you compare to the model split of Glasgow to the one of Amsterdam, you see, and I do believe there's actually an error in the precise percentages here, but a possibility to radically increase space for pedestrians and, most importantly, cyclists and public transport as well. So as a next step, what we did is defining identity, and I could elaborate on this for 50 minutes on its own. I'm not going to do that, but very important to have a sense of identity. Glasgow is completely different to the other UK cities, and we summarized it in what we called Gallas and Creative. I think it's proud, it's brave. It has this tradition of entrepreneurship and of turning pilots into actions, and we build upon that. And I think that's also echoed in the slogan that Glasgow stands for: people make Glasgow. And if you want, our strategy on the DRS could be seen as a branding campaign. You're our city center, and translated to a series of objectives that the city center should connect to the surrounding areas. It should give space for new inhabitants, more space for green, more space for mixity, and create political urgency. Where we did a sort of call out for projects, small scale, medium scale, and large scale, all with very different moments in time, which could lead to sort of our 100+ projects, to this possible map, if you want. Not a sort of top-down plan, but again, a series of strategic interventions, leading to this series of documents and reports, clearly the basis for planning decisions. And it's very valuable to see some of the material also being echoed in the report of the Connectivity Commission as such. So I'm going to click to this part because that's too much in detail for now. I see, mindful of time. So in the second phase, we determined a series of goals to elaborate this further, with a sort of overarching goal being quality of life, to work towards a city that is more dynamic, holistic, healthy and responsible, and thriving and competitive, the three being equally important. But the uttermost at the end, what's in it for us, for the Glaswegians, the citizen, living and working on a daily basis in these neighborhoods, and to take that forward. And sort of connecting in that sense the work of the southwestern parts to the northeastern parts, and as said before, transport and infrastructure being a key element to this. So I would like to highlight a couple of elements on the need for smart and sensitive mobility solutions for this, and some of the issues clearly being addressed already today. But if you look at the center grid, but also the more sort of medieval grid-like structures, you have a city that is highly permeable, but in the current situation also, as said before, sort of covered with this plaque of tarmac with a disproportionate space for cars. And Glasgow, column at the left, the amount of roads compared to the other cities in UK. And again, this was quite clearly an eye-opener to us. And looking at the streets with images like this, or at busy times being covered like this, there's simply work that needs to be done. Clearly with an effect on the air quality in the city center, and in that sense it's interesting to make the comparison to the pictures that we see everywhere in the world of the effect of COVID, flight stopping, travel stopping, etc., etc. So you are able to change this if you want. Put the money where your mouth is. And I really like this quote in that sense: if you plan a city for cars and traffic, you will get traffic and cars. If you plan for people and places, then you get people and places. So people first. This picture speaks for itself as well. And again, shifting this mode of transport, shifting and optimizing that transport hubs is key to be able to improve this life for the Glaswegians and answer to this larger goals and political wish lists, if you want. So we build upon the principles of the Scottish planning policy to reduce the need for travel, where possible to optimize the use of existing infrastructure, provide safe spaces for walking and cycling, optimize accessibility and connection to public transport, develop smart nodes if you want, and facilitate freight movement by rail and by water. And as said today earlier already, of course, with a clear notion of, as well driven and accelerated by the current crisis, to work towards 20-minute neighborhoods. So some elements to highlight, following suggestions that we did for the development of a city that is more pedestrian and cyclist friendly. In short, this principle, sort of less tarmac, less cars, lorries, and dominated public space, but only sort of welcome cars that really need to be there, as clearly stated by the previous speaker as well, comparable percentages that can be found here. And the proposal we did to sort of imply or develop a tartan grid, if you want, the current model, cars in every street, or where you can imagine a super blocks model where sort of alternating streets give access to cars and to people, which gives you the ability to also create and establish the missing connections in a suboptimal cyclist network, and would allow you to develop a system of streets that next to the car, of course, they still sort of deserve space, but give more space to cyclists and pedestrian, and giving a more sort of friendly notion, and again, sort of allowing you to connect to work, to education, and to cultural programs, and give the ability to develop these kind of streets and work towards a city as well that is more clean, that is more green, and that is more healthy, which could be taken further in the relation the city has to the Clyde, where this is the profile as you find it, where it's sort of discussable the amount of lanes that you find there, the separated bus lane, etc., and where a more human-friendly and climate-sensitive profile could be imagined, and where we sketch out these kind of images, being fairly realistic and not being dreamy renders to seduce politicians, enabling the city to connect or to reconnect to the city with a series of lanes and plazas, and to contribute to the development of the cyclists, the Clyde water park, if you want, as a larger project spanning between the Glasgow Green and the Riverside Museum and Kelvin Grove, more towards the west. Secondly, public transport, and as addressed already by some of the speakers, but historically following the sort of dispersed central station, but as well as sort of network of buses that are not necessarily the most efficient in the world, being partially the effect of the privatized system. I saw that in one of the questions coming in already, where it is valuable to sort of analyze and to test, work towards a model where you develop a sort of intelligent split between sort of interconnected or intercity or national bus lanes and sort of local bus system that can be more green, a little bit less noisy, and a little bit more friendly with smart hubs in between them. Of course, building upon technologies that exist. Also, some of the other questions that were addressed in the chat I saw already coming in, and that simply exists, as Iain Docherty said as well. It's there, and we should simply sort of provide it. Building upon the legacy of the Victorian railways, being beautiful, but being a little bit sturdy and not necessarily always on the right positions, but sort of bringing bus connections and train connections closer to each other with smart locations for taxis, and most importantly, shared public bikes as well, and see how we can sort of optimize this and move towards also maybe some of the stations that are a little bit more pride and a little bit more airy in that sense. And last but not least, some suggestions we did for optimizing the impact of private vehicles, where we suggested where the sort of the golden Z, the retail and culture zone, but as well the Clyde zone, can be the calm zones, and can be the basis or generator between sort of different sort of car zones in the city, clearly being linked to parking spaces and sort of avoiding a sort of direct connection between the different areas. Making use of sort of electrification of car potential, and as well smart parking strategies, as you all know. Last mile logistics can be sort of lecture or presentation on itself, but simply needs to be changed to avoid sort of lorries penetrating, entering the city center, to greenify that. The M8, I'm not going to go too much into detail in this, but it's still sort of fascinating and frightening developments that we see here. And in these images, the sort of effect of how this sort of insertion of the M8 by then caused this rupture. And we're not going to say we're going to be able to overcome this completely, but there is work on different levels to work towards optimizing this on national level, to see if we're able to reroute traffic connecting the southwestern part of the country towards Edinburgh and the other way around, but as well on urban scale, to sort of overcome the barrier that the M8 is currently causing, and repairing the stitches, if you want. By
1 minute, please, Jeroen, please.
Yeah, I'll wrap up 1 minute. Untangling the spaghetti of some of the junctions to be able to realize normal city streets, if you want. Inserting and establishing a series of strategic potential connections, and leading to these possible images, where Anderson Cross provides connection again between the city center and the area around, leading to an image like this, being a bit more friendly than the concrete you're facing there, and as well what you can imagine the future usage of Kingston Bridge Viaduct will be like this. So all in all, and as last element as well, the work we're currently doing on High Street to avoid this being a barrier and more being a connector between the city center itself and the areas east of that. Altogether contributing to this possible future update or upgraded map of the city to connect the inner city better to the areas surrounding that. And last but not least, to build, to on one hand contribute an answer to this larger ambition and task that the city has, but most importantly, contribute to improving the life of all Glasgow regions, period. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeroen, very interesting. Could I invite Councillor Loakes and also Karen back on for some Q&A? We've got about 20 minutes left, and as you can imagine, this whole session has generated a lot of questions. If I can try and pull quite a number together, and I'll maybe ask each individual panelist to think about this. What do the panel in general think of introducing mobility hubs, e-scooters and micromobility? And how are such schemes best funded? Councillor Loakes, could I go to you first of all?
Okay, sorry about that. I mean, I think we've been endeavouring to kind of give kind of e-scooter hires, not e-scooter hires, e-bike hires, dockless bike hires, the breadth to experiment in London and in Waltham Forest. I mean, I just don't think they've worked, to be perfectly brutal and frank. And so I'm incredibly sceptical about e-scooters. I think they are literally largely another fad that is largely data driven, is about data mining. You know, we know what works when it comes to two wheels. We know it's a bike. So let's not get over hung up on some of those initiatives as a means to seeing them perhaps as part of an offer. But I think we can get totally hooked up into some of those kind of gimmicks, some of those trials, and they then detract from the fact that we do need to build segregated infrastructure. We do need to reprioritise pedestrians in our public realm and spaces. We need to deprioritise the needs of the car driver to enforce that kind of balance that is right for our towns and city centres. And we need to change the way our neighbourhoods work. You know, if we start honing in on micro transport offers, things, that, then I think we lose sight of it. Let's get the basics right. And we know when it comes to two wheels, the bike is the best and most efficient way of getting around those areas. And there are so many different adaptations now of the bike to cater for just about everyone's needs. Then why do we need to invest time and effort and money and resources in something else?
Okay, Karen, anything to add to that?
No, I would really echo that. I mean, of course, sometimes having an e-bike makes it easier for an older person to stay on the bike longer, someone who's not so fit maybe. But I think, you know, we really have to think about the spaces where that is suitable, because then there can also be challenges with pedestrians. They're faster, you know, there's all sorts of other issues there. So I totally agree. It's maybe part of the mix, but it's a minor part of the mix. And it really depends where they're operating. And inevitably, a lot of people will get them through the private sector. So it tends to be more economically active, fitter, richer people that are using this as an extended transport option on top of everything else they do for leisure rather than for their main activities. It's about getting the essentials right. It's about walkable for everyone.
Thanks, Karen. Jeroen, anything further to add? If you can be brief, please.
No, I think most important things are said. I would like to refer to the VLIP system in Paris, following the remarks by Clyde Loakes. There's a lot of failure, but in my opinion, that's one of the only successful proposals or cases in the world. And I think most importantly, it's about the package. So this is only one of the elements, and it's about the whole package that should be organized.
Thanks. Maybe as a follow-on to that, and I definitely am going to mention it because a number of people came back with the same thing. Clyde, the comment was very inspiring from Councillor Loakes, shows what we need to do, putting walking, cycling and public transport at the heart of our city. Maybe the harder question to Karen and Jeroen, what do you guys suggest are the first steps?
Well, I think it's interesting because this, I mean, I love the fact that you didn't listen to all these protesters with the loud voices and you actually went down and did the analysis and saw who was really doing what. And I think that is important. And this whole thing that you had about, you know, the breaking down perceptions about who's really traveling to where. I think there's a real difference between neighbourhood level stuff, which is perhaps more the Waltham Forest, and then the city centre stuff for Glasgow, which is another issue altogether. They are two separate issues. Glasgow is a world city, and yes, it needs to do all the public space things that you're talking about, but I'm more interested in more peripheral transport, neighbourhood transport, and that really is about rejigging the whole situation. Glasgow has low car ownership levels, and so I think you can really do this, and it's not about being pushed, and it's about brave politicking, very brave politicking. Well done, Councillor Loakes, because that is what we need across the whole of the UK. It's not, these are not attractive options, and people always hate having things taken away from them. If you can somehow start, and there was a question here about bringing buses back into public ownership. I personally think that it at least has to be back into public control, so that we plan the routes, we say what we charge for the fares, we bring that back into the public control, and the buses then tender for, like they do in London. I don't think you can run a model that's better than that for accessibility, and it does cost more, but that's what you get for social inclusion. So I could go on forever, but start at the neighbourhood level, start with the things that you can do immediately and make the situation better, and then you can bring in other things after that.
Yeah, totally agree with you. You can. Certainly as transport planners and engineers, we can do certain things, but we've got to have that political will and commitment. It's got to be driven from the top to make it happen. Any further thoughts on that, Jeroen?
Indeed, it's a combination of acting local and thinking big, so keeping the bigger picture in mind. So I think what's extremely needed in Glasgow, and it's almost like 1,000 easy fixes, is getting the basics right: normal sidewalks, normal crossings, sort of cracky streets, waste cans in the wrong place, simply sort of cleaning up and repairment action. And on the other hand, work towards strategic interventions that take more time and are a little bit more bold. But simply to work on the new strategic connections. Well, I showed a glimpse of that, but also dare to ask yourself the questions: is the bus station, Buchanan bus station, at the right place, or what are alternatives? And you should again sort of dare to investigate that, work on the M8 effect, etc., etc. So a combination of top down, bottom up at the same time.
Thanks, Jeroen. This is maybe one for Karen. I suppose it touches to some extent on transport poverty, and I appreciate, Karen, that you're not familiar with all the areas or issues in Glasgow, but I suppose it'll come as no surprise that in areas with low car ownership in Glasgow, there is a high use of taxis. The taxi fare is quite high. And the way we've gone about it is we're planning obviously for car use, but we're wanting to change that in the future to more cycling, walking, wheeling. What are the solutions in other cities that you've come across, especially with the lack of taxi access, say, to the supermarket?
I mean, there is just has been a complete failure of the community transport sector. And I think that these days we have the tools to be able to plan for really effective networked types of services that are basically like shadow services for these types of things, if we're prepared to invest in them, not as a voluntary thing, but as an offer alongside public transport. We just don't do enough with flexibly routed services. I don't think that any the trouble is the way that Glasgow's laid out, like many cities, you've got these very peripheral areas with high levels of low income and very poor public transport. So we heard about Poulton, for example, and and basically it may not be that you can run commercial bus routes there. So we have to find ways of being not just flexible in terms of the routing, but also the timing of services, so the same bus can be used for multiple destinations, perhaps within a neighbourhood at different times of the day. It's a long issue, but sorry, can't cover it all.
Yeah, no, that's great, Karen. Thanks very much for that. Maybe a question to all of you. and it's one that's very close to my heart. Maybe an easy question to ask, but maybe quite difficult to come up with the answer. How do you think we can support people to change their travel behaviour? In other words, will new infrastructure and services be enough? What do the panel think about that? Councillor Loakes, can I go to yourself first?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got to go out there, and as a politician, this is one of the things you've got to do. You've got to go out there. You've got to win the arguments. You've got to put out your pitch, you know. And the positive thing is, at the moment, and it wasn't there in the 80s, it wasn't there in the 90s when I first became a councillor, is the wealth of evidence that now sits behind why this agenda is important, why this agenda will work. And you've got to go out there and you've got to challenge and you've got to work hard. You can't just sit in a committee room or in a virtual committee room reading papers. You've got to go out there and convince your neighbours. You've got to go out and convince the parents at that school gate that dropping their children off by car is the wrong thing to do, and there are better solutions that they should be invested in, because it is about the health of their children. It's about the lungs of their children, and there's so much information that we can kind of put to them in a way that they will understand as well, not just in a scientific way, in a real positive way that they can understand. So you've got to go out there, you've got to champion, and then you've got to start building the networks of champions. I can go into certain places as a politician, but actually it's far better if another parent goes into the school to talk to other parents about why they're passionate about a school street and the difference that a school street can make overnight, you know. And that isn't even about masses of infrastructure, you know. That's something that can be done literally overnight, and the change is phenomenal. But you have got to put in segregated stuff. You have got to take away space that previously has been only accessible for car drivers, whether it's parking spaces, reducing lanes, widening pavements. You've got to do all of that as well. But the wealth of evidence, the wealth of data now sits behind you, and you cannot be put off by the first petition of a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand signatures, because you have got right on your side. You have got the moral high ground, you know, and never has there been a more important time to be embracing this agenda and embedding what we did during lockdown, you know, and we proved that civilization won't collapse simply by taking space away from the car. We proved that we could adapt, we could walk more, we could cycle more, we could survive, you know, if we did those things. So let's do it now, because never has there been a better time. But politicians have got to be at the forefront of this, and they've got to work with others.
Absolutely spot on, Councillor Loakes. Karen, anything to add?
Just that, you know, if you could get yourself a coalition across all parties that agree to these things, and therefore it's not up for grabs, because it is climate up for grabs. Are our children's lives up for grabs? These shouldn't be political issues. These should just be foregone conclusions. And I'm sorry that you had to fight against someone, you know, that was jumping on the bandwagon to argue the other, Clyde. But, you know, I think if you can make alliances, and it's just, there's no, because the public don't always vote for what is best for everyone. They vote for what they think is best for themselves. There is a selfishness there, and they're not necessarily looking at the whole of society or the whole of environment. They just want what's convenient for themselves. And also the thing about testing things first, evaluating them, putting them in place, and then asking.
Thanks, Karen. Jeroen, anything to add?
What we aim to push as strategic planners from our side is the experience-driven approach, and to develop projects from people's lives perspective. So to change the mindset when we work on mobility solutions, not from an engineer-led approach, from a user-centric approach. And I believe for people to sort of accept the change in this mode of transport, I showed this one scheme regarding this as well. I believe if you compare, for example, to what you see happening in Copenhagen, what we've seen in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and what I see in Edinburgh as well, is that cycling should be cool, should be sexy, walking should be pleasant, and should be a nice experience, and public access to public It should be convenient, and it should not be, again, a sort of technocratic steel or concrete experience. No, it should be fresh and exciting, and it should be healthy.
Okay. Councillor Loakes, I'm going to keep you busy this morning. There were quite a few of the audience were keen to hear about what improvements were made to benefit people who are deaf and have hearing loss in your own local authority. And do you think there could be anything that could be invoked up here which could be to the benefit of Glasgow?
Okay, so I think this kind of falls into the more kind of the wider accessible needs of those with a range of kind of disabilities and kind of, you know, particular needs that need to be designed into this. I mean, I think the debate in Waltham Forest has attempted to move on from this kind of view that you've got to constantly adapt things to make it easier for those people. Whereas actually what we've done is challenge the domination of the car, which is the greatest threat to everyone who isn't in a car in that space. So as opposed to kind of accommodating the car and special needs, we've moved to just challenging the domination of the car, because everyone who walks around is challenged by unbridled car growth and rat running through local neighbourhoods. So if you're calming your streets, if you're taking out traffic, you're making it safer for everyone. If you're giving priority to pedestrians, whatever their needs, so a car is a guest in those spaces, and if you come to Waltham Forest and walk around one of our low traffic neighbourhoods, one of our livable neighbourhoods, before you know it, you are walking in the middle of the road. And when a car approaches you, actually the car's waiting for you to get out of the road. It isn't a confrontation. It isn't about get off my land. It is actually, I know the car's saying, I know I'm a guest in this space, not you. So I'm going to wait for you to get onto the pavement to allow me to pass. And the kind of incentive engagement now is totally different. Now that's taken a number of years to embed, but that's the experience now in Waltham Forest, and that has to be better for everyone. And of course, if we're taking out so many of these excess vehicle movements that don't need to be driven on a day-by-day basis, all of those short car journeys, if people feel safer in walking and cycling more, then actually you're creating the space, you're creating the priority for those who do need to use a car to get about with. You're giving them the real priority rather than sticking them in kind of congestion, which is what we used to do. So again, we're rebalancing our highway network and neighbourhood in favour of those who really need it when they need it. So there's a huge range of things, and this comes down to your parking policies, this comes down to 20 MPA, it's a whole raft of things kind of underpin all of this, but it's about making your area safer for all, safer for the active traveller first and foremost, by challenging the domination of the car, not about constantly amending existing infrastructure to facilitate.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm conscious of the time. It's about 11:58 just now. Still an awful lot of questions to go through, but I think what we'll do with my teams is we'll consider all the questions, but maybe one question again to Councillor Loakes. Do you have any evidence that's available that can be shared on the impact for local businesses of the Mini Holland approach?
So we've got a website, and I'll send you the link if you want to kind of direct attendance at the conference today, and you can kind of put that out to our kind of website that holds all our data, all our cabinet reports and everything, all the decision-making stuff. But what I would do is, Waltham Forest is a world-class borough. It may not be a world-class city, but it's a world-class borough. And I would suggest that you come down and take a walk down Orford Road, take a walk down Francis Road, former shopping parades that were totally challenged and restricted by the domination of through traffic in those neighbourhoods, and then talk to the businesses yourself, and you will see the difference that these interventions have made to how they operate. Now, clearly, what we've had is businesses disappearing, but those businesses have disappeared because they haven't continued to cater for the changing needs of their residents that live around them, and they haven't responded to Amazon and the World Wide Web. You know, they are the bigger challenges to anything that we would do, and the things that we have done have enabled some of our shopping areas and town centres to survive with those bigger global challenges facing them, because we've responded to the data and the evidence that tells us make a place better for people walking, cycling and using public transport, and they will spend more money and they will visit more often.
That's great. That's maybe a very good place to stop, and I'll maybe take you up on that offer. If you can guarantee the sunshine, I'll be down there. Again, we're coming up to 12 o'clock, so can I just thank the three of you for this session. That was absolutely excellent. If Councillor Richardson and or Iain are online, again, a big thank you to them. Could I also thank Landor, who are the organisers. That was really good, the background team, making sure the technology was all working, and a special thanks to my team in pulling everything together, not just for today, but obviously all the documents we've pulled together. But above all, can I say to you, the audience out there, that this is all about you. You can make a difference. You've heard this morning what Councillor Loakes has been saying, and Professor Lucas, etc. We want to hear from you on what kind of city you want over the next 10 years, notwithstanding the challenges we've got with COVID just now. But we really do want to hear from you. And just to let you know that this session, or this whole event, has been recorded. It'll be uploaded onto the Landor website, so you can get access to that there. We had a barload of questions, haven't been able to get through them all, but I can assure you we'll take all your questions on board as we go through the evaluation and analysis of the whole 6-week public conversation period. So thanks once again for attending, and I hope you found it useful, and above all, stay safe. Okay. Bye.
Sure.
Bye.